Cool Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, the Yao Mean of Revolution, and I have a World War III alert. But before we get into that, be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button. Like, share, subscribe, support the platform, y'all. Well, today, revolution is a way of life, and revolution is for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I got some revolutionary breakfast for y'all. We're going to get into the humiliation salute, family of NATO. We got to be very wary because as Putin crushes the Ukrainian soldiers, NATO will have to intervene because the empire's whole system will be defeated if they don't intervene. But if they intervene, that means World War III. They are absolutely being devastated.
A few hours ago, insiders in Kiev began to report that Volodymyr Zelensky, the head of the Kiev regime, has been in an inadequate state for the past 2 days. In particular, many have noticed that Zelensky has become very irritable and aggressive. It is reported that Zelensky even threw an ashtray and glasses at the president's executive office employees. According to insiders, the head of the Kiev regime calms down and regains his senses only after doctors administer some white pills to him. My dear truth seekers, the inadequate state of the head of the Kiev regime can be understood. The fact is that his army is suffering a crushing defeat in all key areas of the front. And even in the Kursk region, for which Zelensky had high hopes. So, a few hours ago, representatives of the Russian military department officially announced that the counteroffensive by the Ukrainian forces in the Kursk region had been completely stopped. Moreover, as it turned out, on January 7th, the Russian army also managed to completely liberate the settlement of Ruskoye Portnoy, which was captured by Ukrainian troops during yesterday's attack in the Sudzansky district of the Kursk region. Let me remind you that the settlement of Ruskoye Portnoy was in a gray zone for 5 months, and came under the control of Ukrainian troops on January 5, 2025, during an attempt to break through the positions of Russian forces in the Sudzansky district of the Kursk region. However, as it turned out, the Ukrainian army units did not stay in this settlement for long. After 20 hours, this settlement was completely liberated by Russian troops. Moreover, on January 7th, building on their success, Russian troops also liberated such settlements as Pogrebki, Kozitsa, Stary Sorokiny, and Krugelkoy. In addition, on January 7th, at 3 p.m. Moscow time, Russian troops also entered the settlement of Novaya Sorokina. Against this backdrop, the Ukrainian army units were threatened with encirclement in the settlement of Cherkaskoye Portnoy. According to an authoritative military expert Oleg Tsarev, the Ukrainian High Military Command has deployed additional reserves to Cherkaskoye Portnoy to prevent Russian troops from entering the settlement. At the same time, this expert noted that everything that is happening in the Kursk region indicates that Russian troops not only repelled the Ukrainian army's attack, but also launched their own counteroffensive. Simultaneously with this, soldiers of the 30th Motorized Rifle Regiment of the Russian Army completely cleared the vicinity of the settlement of Berdyan, where the Ukrainian army was trying to break through during its offensive. According to the commander of the Chechen Spetsnaz Akhmat, General Apty Yelodinov, 45 Ukrainian soldiers and 20 units of heavy equipment were destroyed during the cleansing of the vicinity of this settlement. Moreover, about 50 Ukrainian soldiers and officers from the 82nd Separate Airborne Assault Brigade of the Ukrainian Army raised a white flag, and surrendered to the Russian army. Later, General Abdialadanov showed these prisoners of war and called on the rest of the Ukrainian soldiers to follow their example and not give their lives for the sake of the Nazi regime in Kiev. Moreover, immediately after that, war correspondents began to record mass surrenders of Ukrainian soldiers not only in Sudzansky, but also in the Koronevsky districts of the Kursk region. It is reported that as of January 8, 2025, 70 Ukrainian soldiers laid down their arms and surrendered to the Russian forces. And the most interesting thing is that the number of Ukrainian soldiers who have surrendered is skyrocketing with each passing day. Thus, it is safe to say that the counteroffensive of the Ukrainian army in the Kursk region, organized by the Kiev regime, to show its Western masters that it was too early to write off Ukraine, turned out to be a complete failure. Another suicidal military operation of the Ukrainian army ended with catastrophic losses in manpower and equipment. And at the same time, none of the goals were achieved. According to the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, in the Kursk region, over the past 48 hours, the Ukrainian army has lost 780 soldiers and 80 units of heavy equipment, including 7 units of tanks and 15 units of infantry fighting vehicles. In total, since August 2024, the losses of the Ukrainian army in the Kursk region amounted to 49,870 soldiers and about 3,000 pieces of military equipment, including 298 tanks. By the way, on January 7, Vladimir Zelensky's mood was spoiled by bad news not only from the Kursk region, but also from Donbass. In particular, war correspondents confirmed that after yesterday's liberation of the urban-type settlement of Dakhnoy, Russian troops continued to build on their success and entered the settlement of Shevchenko on the move, northwest of the recently liberated Korokovo. It is reported that the Ukrainian army units were unable to stop the Russian soldiers from the 114th Brigade, and were forced to flee the settlement. As of January 8, 2025, the Russian army has completely liberated the settlement of Shevchenko. Thus, over the past 48 hours, the Russian army has taken full control of 2 strategically important settlements in Korokovo direction of the front, which is an outstanding achievement from a military point of view. Against this backdrop, American experts from The Washington Post have finally admitted that the Ukrainian army has suffered a crushing defeat in the current conflict. According to them, Ukraine loses several settlements and 1,000 soldiers every week. And this factor indicates that time is working against Ukraine. Moreover, the Americans also admitted that Kiev's imminent defeat in this conflict would devastate the United States' reputation and undermine trust in Washington. According to them, Ukraine's defeat in this war will mean that the United States is unable to protect its allies from both an economic and a military point of view. The Americans are confident that Russia's victory in Ukraine will also inspire China. And Beijing will try to solve the Taiwan issue with military force. Russia's future victory in Ukraine will become a true symbol of the weakness of the entire collective West. Thus, even such a pro-government publication as The Washington Post indirectly acknowledged that the current conflict in Ukraine would end solely on Russia's terms and that, in addition to Kiev, the United States would also be considered the losing side.
My friends, the desertion crisis of our beloved Ukrainskaya Armia is worse than I thought. Do you remember how in fall 2024, Ukraine sent an entire brigade to be trained in France? They would get NATO training and they would be fully equipped by the French military. Everything looked very promising.
And it's gone.
Here from Forbes, Ukraine's newest Leopard 2 brigade began disintegrating before it reached the front line. From the Telegraph, flagship...
This is a scandal. We paid for this brigade. We paid almost, I don't know how much money we get, maybe $800 million. A bunch of money for these people to be trained in France. These NATO-trained Ukrainian soldiers. They talking about this in other news medias. They're not talking about this in the U.S. because taxpayers going to be pissed. These phonies got to the battlefield and started running away. Was too scared to even fight the Russians.
Ukrainian brigade trained in France goes AWOL.
A unit is running from the battlefield. A shameful display!
I made an entire video about the training program of this brigade. However, I was extremely skeptical at the end result of this experiment. This leads me to believe that Task Force Champagne only took care of the technical aspect of the training mission, meaning they only formed the mechanized battalions and the artillery component. Meanwhile, the remaining 2,200 soldiers, so the entire second half of the brigade, well, they all trained in Ukraine. Then this entire training mission was dumb and useless. It was all for nothing. Just yet another PR stunt. I don't want to sound pessimistic, but I'm worried for these guys. The Ukrainians will just fill in the gaps with men they snatched off the streets, and the quality of the brigade will just crash. And guess what? It was indeed a disaster. It's not a surprise considering what I learned about this brigade during my research. Essentially, hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers from the 155th Mechanized Brigade deserted before even deploying to combat. In this article by Ukrainian journalist Yuri Butusov, we read, before the brigade fired the first shot, 1,700 soldiers left it voluntarily.
This is madness.
And that was at the end of November. And in December, the brigade witnessed yet again a couple more hundreds of deserters. It keeps going up, and those are only the official figures. Reality is probably much higher. Now, unlike what many people say online, I would highlight the fact that it's not the fault of the French army's training. I mean, just listen to the wisdom that Combat Betterment Paul shared on his YouTube channel. You can't count on the French, but you can always count on the French to be French. And when they got assigned to train a Ukrainian brigade, well, it seems like they may have dropped the ball.
I thought my jokes were bad.
This is such a ridiculous statement because this story of desertion is not an isolated case in the AFU. Put simply, 97% of the Ukrainian soldiers that deserted from the 155th were not the ones that trained in France, but the ones that were trained in Ukraine. Remember what Arestovich, the former advisor of President Zelensky, said in July about the situation in Taretsк.
Могу вам привести случай. На одном из ключевых участков фронта позавчера 6 батальонов отказались выполнять боевую задачу. Соседних. 6. Вы думаете, это единственный случай? Вы думаете, такого не будет повторяться? Вы думаете, это не будет идти по нарастающей? Это не так. Несмотря на всю западную помощь, это потому что в корне лежит неправильное отношение к людям, и люди платят что? Нелояльностью.
This desertion crisis is a systemic issue in the armed forces of Ukraine that we can witness all across the front. We're talking about 100 to 200,000 deserters. If you're interested in the story, I made an entire video about it. In reality, France fully fulfilled all the obligations on arming and training the brigade that the Ukrainians demanded. The problem clearly comes from Ukraine's general staff and its poor management of manpower. Here, this Ukrainian MP wrote, the French tried to make the brigade specialized, but did not save it from the stupid military decisions of our generals and tore the unit apart. So in this video, we will analyze the entire situation from the beginning so that you can get the full picture of what happened to the French-trained 155th Mechanized Brigade. Spoilers, we even have a testimony of one of the deserters of this brigade. Welcome to History Legends, and here are the latest news of the Russo-Ukrainian War. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. As you know, some of my videos have been targeted with limited or no ads. So make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal to keep the show running. Thank you to everyone that has already helped, and welcome to the headquarters. So you remember how in March 2024, the General Staff of Ukraine announced the creation of yet another brigade. The new one would be the 155th. It was to be commanded by Dmytro Ryumshin, the former commander of the 47th Mechanized Brigade. However, since there were no heavy weapons for the formation, it was labeled as 155th Infantry Brigade. So President Zelensky came up with a plan to involve Ukraine's NATO allies to form 14 new brigades. The idea was for Ukraine to provide the military personnel, and for NATO partners to find all the necessary equipment. The French military took the lead of this project. That's how the 155th Infantry Brigade was relabeled as 155th Mechanized Brigade and given the name Anne de Kiev in honor of symbolic historical ties between France and Ukraine. In September 2024, the brigade went for intensive training in France, mostly to learn how to use all these new French weapons and vehicles. From the outside, everything looked promising. Now, despite the fact that I was limited by open source information, I could already see the cracks in the narrative. Like I said, I made an entire video about it if you're interested. Since then, new information was released to the public, and now we have the complete picture of this shipwreck. First of all, Zelensky's PR stunt cost Ukraine 900 million euros, and 80% of the cost was to pay for the heavy weapons like tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery pieces. So it wasn't free help, but that wasn't the worst. You will understand why in a minute. Although the 155th Brigade was officially created in March 2024, recruitment only began in June, and recruits started undergoing basic training. That's how the brigade grew extremely fast over the summer. That's when the drama of this entire story started. You see, it was Operational Command West that was responsible for the creation of this brigade. The moment the brigade had gathered a sizable force, between July and August, more than 2,500 personnel from the 155th Mechanized Brigade were taken away to replenish other units. The General Staff of Ukraine effectively pillaged the brigade from all its manpower, only for the 155th to act like an organ donor for the entire Ukrainian army. Ukrainian media TSN.ua wrote, they took almost all the fully qualified personnel from the brigade, whom the brigade commander and combat units had just assigned to positions, effectively nullifying all the previous 4 months of work.
Madness and stupidity.
All the soldiers, but also most of the command structure just vanished, bringing the brigade back to square one. Even worse, during these chaotic times, the brigade already reported over 750 deserters. In response, can you guess what the General Staff did? That's right, they gathered a fresh new batch of men snatched from the streets and bussified them into the ranks of the 155th. What could possibly go wrong? Now we're in August. Slowly, the new mobilized personnel are going through basic training. In September, the men of the 155th and the Kiev Brigade were told that they would be sent to France for training, to get a really good grasp at the BBC waiting for them there. A very thorough battalion and brigade course. Now, to be honest, as you could see, brigade is a very strong word. The formation that was sent for training in the camp of Mourmelon was far from an organized military structure whose elements could learn a lot. It was simply a crowd, a pack of tired men in army fatigues. Overall, that's how 1,924 Ukrainian soldiers ended up in a training camp in northeastern France. Of these 1,900, only 51 had combat experience and had been in the army for more than a year. We can't believe these guys ended up being the actual instructors. Another 459 men had served for less than 12 months. The majority, 1,414 people, had been mobilized less than 2 months prior. A batch drafted throughout the summer as replacements for the 155th. Even worse, 150 of them had just been snatched off the streets a couple days before and did not even go through basic training. From what I understood, only 30% of the COs necessary were present, and the officers didn't even know each other. So to fill in the positions on the Excel spreadsheet, many of the rank and file were promoted at random. Radio Free Europe interviewed one of these deserters of the 155th, and he told them, Since I have a higher education, I was immediately awarded the rank of junior officer, and that's how he was appointed platoon commander of an engineering unit. He also stated that SEALs like him did not go through basic training, meaning he would not even get to learn how to use a weapon or how to navigate a trench network. Not surprisingly, he admitted that he wasn't feeling ready at all to lead a group of 30 men right into battle. That's when his superiors told him, "Don't worry, you will be sent to France for training." When doing my initial research on the 155th Mechanized Brigade, I naturally had to go through a lot of French language sources, and I stumbled upon certain comments on various YouTube videos. Now, there were rumors from French people living in the vicinity of the camp of Mourmelon that Ukrainian military police kept chasing after deserters day and night across the forests. Honestly, I didn't believe it, because it was just some random comment. Turns out it was true. During the French training mission, more than 50 Ukrainian soldiers deserted. Most of them came from the batch that had just been recently bussified into the military. To put things into perspective, that's 2.65% of all the soldiers that were sent to France for training. Our deserter told the Radio Free Europe that the French military camp looked more like an open-air prison. The territory where we lived was completely fenced off. The French walked around with dogs. Drones were launched over this territory at night. The fence was with barbed wire. Honestly, if we weren't being watched, like in prison, half of us would have escaped. In other words, we can say that the French army prevented the complete brigade from deserting right on the spot. Anyway, during one of those nights, our deserter friend took his chance and escaped. Meanwhile, there were no official statements from the French army, but we can believe all these desertions raised questions about Ukraine's strategy to fill in the ranks. The French officers must have thought that these Ukrainian mobilized personnel have not even suffered a single casualty and they're already trying to escape. What is it going to be like on a battlefield? Now we get to the big scam of the 155th Mechanized Brigade. As you know, the theoretical strength of a Ukrainian brigade is about 5,000 men. Yet, in the media, it was announced that roughly 2,000 Ukrainian soldiers would be sent for training in France. Honestly, at first, I didn't think anything of it because that's the actual size of many Ukrainian brigades these days. But while digging, I found something interesting, that there was a second part of the brigade that was being trained in Ukraine. And that's when I knew Ukraine effed up. So the entire second half of the brigade, well, they all trained in Ukraine. Then this entire training mission was dumb and useless. It was all for nothing. Just yet another PR stunt. In the end, it's just yet another Ukrainian mechanized brigade, but with French equipment. I don't want to sound pessimistic, but I'm worried for these guys. The General Staff of Ukraine decided to fill in the ranks of the 155th Mechanized Brigade with, you guessed it, 4,000 freshly mobilized personnel. So now you had Team A training in France and Team B training in Ukraine. Actually, let me show you the full breakdown. Effective strength of the 155th on the left and official number of desertions on the right. The total amounts to 1,726 desertions over the lifespan of the brigade, from March to November. This is also what Yuri Butusov complained when he made this video that went viral. It's also interesting to see that about 10% of the total number of military personnel deserted every month, which is approximately the same rate we can see across the entire front. Overall, while 50 soldiers deserted from the component training in France, or 2.65%, we can see that the component training in Ukraine reported another 924 desertions between September and November, out of this contingent of 4,000 men. That's 25%. It's huge. And remember, those are only the official figures. So you cannot blame the French army's training for all these desertions. Starting on the 15th of November 2024, the rank and file that trained in Mourmelon began returning to Ukraine. But the brigade's headquarters remained another 2 weeks for extra training, for which their French instructors gave them the highest marks. Once again, everything looked promising. Yet, during those 2 weeks of absence of the brigade's commander, Operational Command West once again plundered, pillaged the 155th Mechanized Brigade from both its human and material resources. They completely dismembered the battalions that the French army had carefully built, dispatching manpower and armored vehicles left and right across the front. Apparently, the Milan anti-tank squads that the French had trained for weeks were transferred to rifle companies.
This is absolute madness.
When Brigadier General Ryumshin and the headquarters finally returned to France, they were horrified to see what had become of their brigade. It had effectively disappeared. And not only that, now they had to deal with an extra mass of 3,000 to 4,000 poorly motivated Mobics. Ryumshin immediately worked to get back control and salvage what he could from this formation. Within a few days, he had already managed to sort through this chaos. That's when the General Staff of Ukraine blamed him for the desertion of 50 people in France. And you know what? Because of that, he was removed from his post, as well as several staff officers and battalion commanders. Do you understand how ridiculous this is? What about the other 1,700 deserters? Let me reassure you, the commander of the Operational Command West, the true responsible of this entire mess, well, he's still in position to this day. Oh, but of course, it's the fault of the French army. One sensible option would have been to promote commanding officers of the brigade and take one of the battalion commanders, for example, and promote him to brigade commander. Nope, we're in Ukraine. Rumshin was replaced by Colonel Taras Maximus, general of the armies of the North, former commander of the 14th Mechanized Legion, loyal servant to the true emperor. Wrong movie. Effectively, by early December, the Andekiev brigade that France had formed was no more. All the training and advice provided by the French army was just thrown out of the window. Meanwhile, the brigade servicemen that remained in the 155th became hostages of Zelensky's PR project.
Fuck.
Technically, I could stop the story here. But you know what? I can't, because it gets worse. The new commanders that were appointed didn't know anyone under them, and apparently none of them had any type of combat experience either. As a result, command and control fell to the ground. Due to all this chaos, in the first week of December, another 198 soldiers deserted from the brigade, effectively bringing the total to 2,000 desertions. At this point, the 155th Mechanized Brigade was just a shadow of its former self. Only a mass of riflemen that did not even want to be there. All the weapon specialists had to be trained from scratch. Barely any vehicles to be reported. You get the picture. The General Staff then sent several instructors from the 10th Mountain Brigade Edelweiss to make soldiers out of this mass of Mobics. Despite their best efforts and a quick crash course, these instructors could only express their doubts on the combat capability of the 155th Mechanized Brigade. The biggest weakness of this brigade was the lack of UAV operators. On paper, 6 UAV platoons were attached to every mechanized battalion, plus a separate UAV battalion of 3 companies. In reality, the brigade could only gather 150 drones, of which 137 Mavic 3s. That's nothing. You can see how many drones are used on a daily basis in Ukraine. That's like sending a rifleman for an assault with only 1 magazine. This means the 155th Mechanized Brigade would go into battle with no means of reconnaissance, which is essential to conduct modern warfare. Naturally, the lack of drones would deeply affect command and control. To make things even worse, according to the report of Butusov, the brigade also faced a complete lack of electronic warfare capabilities. The 155th Mechanized Brigade was not ready for combat. Despite what all the instructors and external observers said, someone up in the hierarchy put pressure to mark this unit as fit for duty. That's how a certain Colonel Hamilsky hastily dispatched the units to the front, without even giving them proper time to prepare. If that's not criminal, I don't know what it is. Because of that, there was no time to equip armored vehicles with the necessary protection, such as cages and explosive reactive armor. There was also a problem with the artillery component. The 120mm mortar shells produced by the Ministry of Strategic Planning and Industry turned out to be defective. On December 4, during test firing, not a single one of 10 shells exploded. This means the mortar crews could not provide fire support. Knowing Ukrainian management skills, these guys were probably transferred to rifle companies. I also read reports that the General Staff of Ukraine actually tricked France, as they never intended to keep this brigade united. It was just a big scheme to get more weapons from the West. Let's just say that France will rethink twice before repeating the experiment. The tragedy of it all, instead of deploying these guys in a calm sector, for these mobilized personnel to get acclimatized to the realities of war. Nope, they were sent right into the furnace. No surprise, that's what the Ukrainian army always does. In December, there was evidence that elements of the 155th Mechanized Brigade had been transferred to the front. Here we see Leopard 2A4 tanks being transported to Pokrovsk. That's where the 155th got its baptism of fire, the hottest sector in Ukraine. We don't have much information as to what happens on the front, but I'll share with you what I heard from the various sources. Ukrainian journalist Butusov emphasized that the soldiers of the 155th Mechanized Brigade performed their duties with the highest merit, but with high losses due to the lack of combat experience. Here from the 25th of December, we see a burnt VAB in the Kurakhove sector. This one, another VAB that got heavily damaged. And in this footage from the 29th of December, we see a destroyed AMX-10 RC, also from the Kurakhove sector. Not only were these poor Mobiks sent to the Pokrovsk front, they were sent right into this freaking collapsing pocket. Because of all this drama, eventually we learned that Ukraine launched a criminal probe into the 155th. Apparently, Zelensky emphasized that he is taking the investigation under personal control. But according to some rumors, I hear that the blame will be shifted on Brigadier General Ryumshin, and not the actual people responsible for this entire mess. According to the latest news, the General Staff claims they have reinforced the 155th Brigade with unmanned units. That's the best definition of too little, too late. Hopefully the AFU can learn from this and improve things. But I fear that the window of opportunity is quickly closing. That's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section.
All right, so let's start with the big story that we are tracking on beyond at this hour. So as Russia's military gains momentum on the battlefield, Ukraine is facing a bit of an internal crisis. There is a surge in desertions, and this is depleting its ranks at a pretty critical juncture in the war. With manpower dwindling and morale sinking, Kiev, of course, risks losing its footing both on the battlefield and also in future ceasefire negotiations. Take a look at this report.
Russian forces intensified their assault. Fighter jets, drones, and missiles pound Ukrainian positions. Artillery shells rain down relentlessly, and Russian tanks carve through Ukrainian defenses across frozen battlefields. In this harsh winter offensive, Ukraine faces another graver challenge: desertion. Soldiers are abandoning their posts in alarming numbers, leaving critical gaps in defense lines. Even outside the battlefield, cracks are showing. In France, where the Ukrainian brigade, Anne of Kiev, is undergoing military training, dozens of soldiers have reportedly deserted. The brigade, part of an effort to bolster Ukraine's readiness for Russian offensives, now struggles with morale and discipline issues. On the Eastern Front, the desertion problems deepens. Facing relentless Russian bombardment and witnessing comrades fall, many Ukrainian soldiers are abandoning their posts. Accounts from the trenches paint a grim picture of soldiers overwhelmed by the unrelenting violence.
It happened that we were attacked. We were pulling back, and after that, many of us didn't really want to return to the position. And the battalion commander started gathering the ones left, and we didn't want to attack back. That was our trigger. We wanted to live.
When you are on a position, engaged in fighting under constant shelling, it's not seen as you have a big concussion, so you're not taken to a hospital. Even just staying under constant shelling results in gradually damaged mental state. You go crazy step by step. You're all the time under stress. huge stress, and you don't control yourself anymore.
They're not going to talk about this on fake news media. We're going to talk about it. The whole world know it. The Ukrainians don't want to fight no more. Only people want to fight is NATO is forcing these people to fight, and they're forcing people to the front at gunpoint because the people at the front, they don't want to fight no more. Russia's only getting stronger, and they only getting weaker.
The numbers are staggering. Over 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been charged under desertion laws since the Russian invasion began in 2022. Compounding the crisis, Kyiv struggles to recruit new troops, leaving critical vulnerabilities as Russian forces seize territory at the fastest rate since the war's early days. Desertion, dwindling recruitment, and relentless Russian pressure creates a perilous situation for Ukraine. The outcome could reshape the war's trajectory and determine Kyiv's leverage in future peace talks. As the crisis escalates, Ukraine must find a way to stabilize its forces or risk losing not just ground, but the war itself. Bureau Report, we own World is One.
All right, now to give us more perspective in terms of what is happening at this moment in the Russia-Ukraine war, we are joined by retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, who's a military expert and also the host of Daniel Davis Deep Dive on YouTube. He's joining us live in this broadcast. Now, Colonel Davis, now looking at what is happening in the Kursk offensive, the reports that are coming in, they point that there are Ukrainian soldiers who are deserting their positions even within the Kursk offensive. Now, the original idea of the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to carry out the Kursk offensive was to help Ukraine negotiate better. Do you think that strategy has now completely failed?
Completely, and it was stillborn. It never had a chance because the Russians have been showing since they have been methodically reducing the amount of territory in the Kursk salient that the Ukrainians have since it got its high water mark probably early September or so of last year. Since that time, it's been going down and down. It hasn't been moved fast. The Russians have not been able to have a big movement to just kind of knock it out, but it is methodically and irreversibly moving down. So Russia can and almost certainly will eventually reduce that by force of arms. There is no reason why the Russians would at any point say, all right, we're going to stop doing that, what we can do, and then give away something elsewhere in order to get that territory back. So there's no evidence that ever had a chance to succeed.
And also, we're just about a fortnight away before Donald Trump takes charge at the White House. Donald Trump had said that he has a plan and he can bring about peace very, very quickly in a day once he assumes the presidency. But he seems to have gone fairly quiet about his plans for bringing about peace in Ukraine. Why do you think Donald Trump at this moment is reticent in spilling out what he has in his mind for Ukraine?
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense because you don't want to, publicly give away your negotiating strategy or let your opponent know what you are or are not willing to give or take in any given area. I'm sure that he's doing a lot of internal discussion. I know from some on his team that that's something they're working on right now. A big note overnight that the General Kellogg, his President Trump's envoy for the Russia-Ukraine war, canceled a trip that he had planned just within the next couple of days to go to Kiev and then to several European capitals to talk about different parts of the plan. That was canceled, which tells me that they're probably doing some more internal discussions about what they actually want to do or what they think is possible before they even send our emissary to our allies. So I think that President Trump is now very much aware of the real situation to go on the ground. He's, I think, now authorized to get intelligence reports as he's the incoming president. So he has a better visibility of it than he did during the campaign. And all those things are going into figuring out what he's going to do.
Interesting. Thank you very much indeed, Colonel Davis, for joining us with those details there.
Always my pleasure.
launch ATACMS, about 8 of them, into the Belgorod region. Russia says they shot all of them down. Russia has said that they will retaliate and that the collective West is a major part of this attack, meaning that nothing is off the table. However, there's a lot of considerations to be made here. And Scott, I want your first reaction on this attack and where it fits into the overall picture for the Ukraine conflict.
Well, I mean, the use of ATACMS by Ukraine is probably one of the most dangerous events of this entire conflict. It's the one that has the risk of bringing us closer to nuclear war with Russia than just about anything else that's been manifested in this conflict. And the reason is that the ATACMS missiles fired from Ukrainian soil have the potential to hit targets of strategic interest for Russia, targets of strategic sensitivity. And if enough of these targets are struck at the same time in concert with other conventional weapons releases from Ukrainian soil, for instance, of Scalp missiles and the French or the British Storm Shadow, I think the Scalp is the French system. This could be part of what Russia would fear to be a preemptive attack, seeking to decapitate Russian leadership or otherwise suppress Russian strategic capabilities. And this is something that Russia has always had a doctrine saying they would respond to, but now they've specifically addressed this very issue in their most recent doctrine. And in short, the use of these missiles from Ukrainian soil, even by Ukrainian forces, because these missiles were provided by the United States, targeted by the United States, etc., this exceeds the threshold necessary for Russian nuclear weapons release. And I just want to make that point one more time. The use of ATACMS missiles by Ukrainians against Russian soil exceeds the threshold set by Russia in its nuclear doctrine for release of nuclear weapons. So if we wanted to go to war, nuclear war, if Russia, doctrinally, the smoking lamp has been lit. Fortunately, Russia doesn't want to go to nuclear war, and Russia has sent a signal to the United States. There was a phone call sometime in November between General Gerasimov and General Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Russian Chief of Staff. The contents of the content haven't been publicly released in terms of a transcript, but the one of the topics that has been claimed to have been addressed in this is that Gerasimov said, look, if as long as the ATACMS are used to a certain range threshold, we'll just blow the crap out of Ukraine. That'll be our response. If it exceeds that threshold, then we're coming after you. And so far, Ukraine has been firing ATACMS missiles below that threshold. So if the reported conversation is true, all parties have received notice. The problem is Ukraine is desperate. You mentioned in your opening statement about an offensive in Kursk. It's literal suicide. I'm sure Andre and Larry will be able to add things to that. It didn't work. It's not going to work. They're all dying. Zelensky is furious at Syrsky because he was supposed to create something that allowed Zelensky to, in effect, blackmail Trump and say, you have to continue funding me. Look what happens when you give me money and the great successes the Ukrainian army has. We need to go on. But instead, all the Ukrainian soldiers dead. It didn't work. The Ukrainians are desperate. And my concern is that the Ukrainians will release ATACMS at ranges greater than the threshold set by Russia. And in that case, I believe Russia will use the Oreshnik missile, multiple numbers of the Oreshnik missile, against targets of strategic value. They won't be nuclear attacks, but Russia will pound the living snot out of Ukraine using Oreshniks. And it'll be a statement not just for Ukraine, but for Trump as well. And the statement is, we really don't care about you anymore. You're irrelevant to us. You mean nothing to us. We're going to finish this war the way we want to finish it. And you get in our way, that's going to happen to you. We're not playing games here. And it's also a message being sent to the British who are behind the Kursk offensive. This is a British operation, British planned, conceived. It's part of the British mindset of how to keep Ukraine in the fight. And it's a message to the British, and it's a message to the French, who still operate under some misconception that, and the Germans, that they can send troops to Ukraine, and that the conditions will be created there. They can send these troops to Ukraine. I think Russia, if pushed, will send a strategic signal in the form of multiple Oreshnik missiles that will have horrific impact on the targets, because the targets that will be selected, I believe, won't be a throwaway demonstration target. I think it will be a target of strategic value and of visual value, meaning it can't be hidden behind a wall. For instance, if Bankova Street ceased to exist, that would be one such target. And I think the Russians are in the mood right now where they may be ready, willing, and able to pull that trigger. That's one step short of the next to last step before a nuclear war, because if that doesn't work, the next thing is to strike NATO targets. And I believe that three most likely targets are the two anti-ballistic missile systems, and one in Poland, one in Romania, and Ramstein Air Base comes up there as well as the heart of the logistics transfer. And then the next step after that is nuclear war, and it's so we're 3 steps away from a nuclear war. And Ukraine appears ready, willing, and able to facilitate that. That's what has me worried.
Larry, I wanted to just bring you in and ask what your reaction is to, Scott used the word desperation. We have these reports about a renewed offensive in Kursk. How do you see these developments given what Scott just said there?
Well, since we're in the middle of playoff season in the National Football League, and even most of the rest of the world has become acquainted with American football. Let me use a football analogy. The Russians are ahead 70-0, okay? And we're in the 4th quarter. And it doesn't matter how many Hail Mary passes, how many onside kicks, how many desperation plays the Ukrainians make. They ain't going to win. They're losing. They have lost. There is no recovery from this. And it is the proverbial chicken with its head cut off, running around, bleeding everywhere, creating some mayhem and chaos. And I think the Russian leadership understands that they're not getting too excited, too emotional about it. They're going to secure their victory. They understand that, the West is so detached from reality with respect to, we'll get a freeze in place. Yeah, the credibility of the West is now zero with respect to Russia. They've been screwed over through whether it's the withdrawal from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, Minsk I, Minsk II, the withdrawal from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, and then the betrayal in Turkey, where they actually they had a negotiated settlement back in March, April of 2022. So there's nothing that Ukraine can do that's going to change the outcome. The trajectory is set. Like I said, they can throw Hail Mary passes. They may even score a touchdown here and there. Doesn't change the final score, doesn't change the outcome.
Andre, could you provide an assessment of this, what we've heard about this so-called Kursk offensive, this renewed launch of attacks, as Ukraine has already been pushed down to the Suja region. Now they're saying that they are on the offensive again, or at least that's what the Western mainstream media says. What is the reality on the military front?
Western media, the same as most media in the world, do not understand the difference between offensive and attack. And attack is a maneuver. Okay? So they it's about 10 hours ago, they tried to conduct attack in 2 battalion groups. After 6 hours, there are no battalion groups left, and there's no attack. They just literally, washed themselves in blood. They were met with obvious, firepower which is there. And Abtiel Udinov actually went on TG channel about 3 hours ago. He said, it's over. It's gone. There's nothing there. I mean, only the burned equipment and, as usual, bunch of the corpses. And that's what it is. It's even one of the headlines today in Russian media. I don't remember which one. They say they use their Ukrainian cannon fodder for the fireworks, for firecrackers. Just to hey, we're here. Help us. Correct about Trump. Now, if people do not understand the scale of this, today, January 5th. I wish it was August, but January 5th, 49,000 killed of the Ukrainian forces in Ukraine, Kursk alone. So they lost their huge combined arms army there. And as Scott stated, British or French, these guys are not professionals in operation planning. They are looked at as amateurs. They still believe they operate within this, I don't know. They evidently do not understand the modern battlefield. They do not understand how it works. They do not understand how to calculate proper force. They do not understand how to sustain it. But you would expect this from British and French, especially British, with their, quoting Doug McGregor, Lilliputian force. And their military education is a joke. So there you go. And as a result, we have these numbers. Today alone, 2,500 killed along the front line. So 18 years old are coming. And this will be the last of the sperm bank of Ukraine. The Russians will oblige, they will kill them all.
Scott, there have been some who have come to me and said, or have sent me messages, communicated with me saying, each time that Ukraine launches ATACMS. I know they don't have that many left, but they've been launching them consistently since they received approval from the United States, or green light, or whatever we want to call it. They say that the response has been too soft, that there hasn't been a hard enough response to this. What do you have to say to people who say this? Most people who have come to me with this reside in the collective West. They're observing it from the outside. And they believe Russia should take an even harder response to these transgressions.
Well, I think Larry touched upon this. Russia's winning. Well, how hard do you want Russia to get? Go to the front line in the line of contact anywhere, in Kursk or anywhere, and count the dead bodies. They're almost all Ukrainian. Look at the advances being made. It's all by Russia. Russia has a strategic objective in this conflict that's been consistent from day one, and they're achieving it. The one thing that can disrupt this is if you do something that changes the military correlation of forces. And the only way to rapidly change the military correlation of forces to the detriment of Russia is to introduce NATO forces or European forces in significant numbers. And that's a political decision that can't be made under the current circumstances because the costs would be unacceptable to the West. But if Russia overreacts, if Russia does something that creates a new political, operating environment where suddenly people in Europe take a look at the risk gain analysis and say, hey, Russia's gone insane. We have no choice now. We have no choice but to commit to a Ukrainian fight. It doesn't matter that Russia will probably win that fight. That's a fight Russia doesn't want. Russia is not looking for a war with NATO. Russia is not looking to expand this conflict. Russia is looking to win the special military operation and achieve the objectives that have been laid out very clearly by the Russian leadership. So I would tell the people that are looking to, strike harder, go get your passport, travel to Russia. I'm sure you can find one, some unit to sign up with. They'll give you uniforms and you get to play soldier for a day, go down there and die. If you want to hit harder, go hit. Otherwise, shut up. Because if you don't have sweat equity or blood equity, if you're an analyst, Stop talking about other people dying. I mean, if you're going to say Russia has to strike harder, explain why. Why do you believe Russia has to strike harder, other than, serving their, their need to, be a part of the conflict, remote control? No. If you're an analyst, then you have to step back and you have to assess. Now, if they wanted to come in and say, we believe that the ATACMS missiles are having a significant strategic impact on Russian command and control, logistics, all this, and that left unresponded to, or left responded to with the soft report, the correlation of forces are going to shift in a matter of 2-3 weeks, and the Ukrainians are going to achieve battlefield dominance that will be strategically decisive against Russia. If they want to make that claim, then you can say, yeah, maybe Russia has to hit harder. But as Larry said, Russia's ahead 70-0. And if Ukraine wants to make the score 14-70, the game's still lost. But I'm just telling you right now, A, they're not going to score 2 touchdowns. And B, in playing the Russians hard like that, they're going to get so many injuries that the final score is going to be 120-0. That's the reality. There's nothing that can happen right now to change the outcome other than changing the political environment that allows NATO to think they have to intervene. Russia is not going to do a favor to Ukraine. That's my perspective. Russia's hitting as hard as Russia needs to hit, and it's pretty damn hard. It's pretty damn hard. People, I don't know what they think's going on the front lines now. They think it's a game. They think Russia's around there just doing a waltz and all this. Russian soldiers are fighting and dying every day in some of the harshest modern warfare conditions you have ever seen. They're fighting against an enemy who is tenacious, an enemy that if you make a mistake because they have training, they have weaponry, they will kill you. And there's a lot of dead Russians that prove that point. The Ukrainian army's pretty damn good. They're probably better than any of the NATO advisors whispering sweet nothings in their ears. And those boys are out there fighting and dying on a battlefield against Russians who are fighting their butts off, and you want them to hit harder? The people who say that have no clue whatsoever what they're talking about. And I apologize for getting angry, but I just get tough. I get very upset with armchair warriors who think that they're, that they can type on their keyboard, hit harder, and that somehow means that they're real men. If you're a real man, get off your ass, go to the battlefield, strap up, go to the front line. And if you make it, you come home, I'll buy you a beer and say, wow, you're hard.
Larry, when Scott was saying sorry for being angry, I was thinking, why? Because this is this whole situation is infuriating, to say the least. I mean, we have an endless, what seems to be a forever war that the United States and NATO are continuing to push. Do you see, Larry, any possibility for some kind of shift in the U.S. and NATO's policy vis-a-vis Ukraine?
Well, it's going to be compelled by what Russia does, because they're not going to willingly do it on their own, I don't think. And part of the problem was, and this is now, I think, been pretty well exposed over the last 4 weeks. When Donald Trump was doing his Person of the Year interview with Time Magazine, he started talking about the casualties that were being suffered by both Ukrainians and the Russians, and he had the Russians suffering a lot more casualties, and basically said that that's what he was being briefed on. So that means the CIA and maybe the Defense Intelligence Agency, they're briefing Ukrainian lies. They're briefing what the Ukrainians are telling them. And instead of any kind of independent analysis by the CIA to come in and say, yeah, this is what Ukraine says, but we have double checked, we've looked at this, we've done some other efforts to corroborate it, and it's not true, it's the exact opposite. That's not what's happening. So what you have is an intelligence community that's misleading the policymakers. And the policymakers are going into this with a set of assumptions, which are just flat out wrong. If we flip the script, if Russia was doing to the United States via Mexico or Canada or some other proxy what the United States has been doing to Russia via Ukraine, we would have already declared war and used nuclear weapons, probably. And so it bespeaks of the patience and the wisdom, I would attribute it to wisdom on the part of Putin to recognize that there are great risks that accompany this. And part of the problem that undergirds this is the United States has never paid a price in any of its wars, including World War II. We haven't paid a price in war since the Civil War. And what I mean by a price is that when, say, 10%, 20% of the population experience loss, usually it's about less than 1% of our population experience loss, have lost a son, a father, an uncle, a cousin in battle. And so because we've never paid that kind of price, we're very cavalier and careless when we go meddling about overseas and don't care what happens if we touch off a war. Whereas Vladimir Putin and his Russian cohorts, they understand it, because during World War II, about 16% of the Russian population experienced a combat casualty in their family. At least 16%. And when you add in the wounded, the number gets up closer to like a third of the entire population of the then Soviet Union, but Russia in particular, experienced loss. So they understand that that this is not a game. And the thing that I find so outrageous are these generals, these retired hacks who, as Andre correctly notes, have never won a war in their entire career, and yet they sit around and pontificate about Russia should have done this and Russia should have done that, and these are the guys that couldn't even beat a bunch of goat herders in Afghanistan after 19 years. So the short answer to your question, after a long-winded response, is no. The West, Russia would be a fool to accept any kind of negotiating position from the West, because Russia's holding the cards, and Russia wants something much bigger than just an end to cessation of hostilities in Ukraine.
Andre, you've written many books, especially not just on geopolitics, but the overall how we should understand both the military and political aspects of geopolitics. And I wanted to ask you, I think, earlier when I asked Scott about the people who send me messages talking about, well, Russia needs to go harder. They need to smash Ukraine quickly. They need to end this right now. I wanted to ask you, from the perspective of Russia in the overall geopolitical situation, why is it then that Russia decides to pursue the path it has in this war of attrition on the battlefield? And perhaps you could also update beyond the Kursk region what's happening on the battlefield that might help us understand this.
Well, Scott and Larry already stated that actually Russia's objectives are clearly stated since the day one, pretty much. And for those people who also wanted to know what is the special military operation, the chief of the GOL, which is main operational directorate, Colonel General Rudskoy, he spoke about this in March 2022. It's just that nobody listened. And so when you have these people, as Larry correctly stated, CIA, whatever the hell those guys, they never saw anything like this. They don't have reference point. They do not understand this is the largest war in Europe since World War II. And now today we reached more than 1 million. And so, altogether, we're looking probably at around 3 million casualties, killed and wounded and missing in action for Ukraine. And in this case, there is nothing really to add, because why would Russia kill more of its soldiers when you have the enemy which literally comes to you? Because this is the only thing they know, and it's like they think that movie pattern is the, documentary. And but the reality of war, of course, is much more prosaic, and it's much bloodier and much dirtier as anything out there. And there is no need to throw, for example, all those big arrow offensives, to capture something which you can move approximately 1 kilometer a day along the most of the front line, and you can still achieve what is the most important thing, which is now they want to Gerasimov doctrine. Well, here's Gerasimov doctrine. If to rephrase Clausewitz's famous dictum that the main object of war is to compel the enemy to do our will, Gerasimov doctrine, as well as the Russian whole, mindset, is the main object in the war is to physically annihilate the enemy and then dictate our will. And that's exactly what is happening. And judging by the panic and exasperation and desperation in media and all those nincompoops who pretend that they understand what is going on, as Larry correctly stated, they come up with, and they basically brief lies. And I encountered on a number of occasions, it's just what is this most terrifying is those people who are supposed to be professionals, they be that CIA, be that US Army, whoever they are, the Defense Intelligence Agency, they swallowed this hook, line, and sinker, this propaganda from Ukraine. It's literally terrifying. Guys, where's your tactical and operational awareness, situational awareness? And they produce those numbers which are preposterous, but they don't have toolkit, even supposedly very many of those professionals, to even make the adjustment or even to make proper assessment, because you need to understand how it all works. They still do not understand how it all works. They still throw in, if you look attentively at this pattern, some of it is British plan, others are American plans or joint plans. That's the only thing they know, how to throw the troops at the wall and see what sticks. So they did already now the million killed of Ukrainians. How many millions maimed and absolutely scarred for life? We can only we can only imagine, and that is catastrophe for them. And the ramifications, of course, are, and Russia is not going to, I agree with both Larry and Scott, that Russia is not going to allow some kind of the PR effects, because we have the guys, let's keep it, Scott said it, Larry said it, you have those gamer boys, primarily from the mama's basements, okay, who wanted an instant gratification. It's like buying the hamburger, in McDonald's, just drive through, get me the hamburger, give me more, this adrenaline, just to see all those wonderful pictures. Reality, of course, is that, yes, as Scott correctly stated, it cannot get any harder than that unless we want to go full Monty, and then it's going to be bad for everyone.
As a result of the liberation of the city of Kurikovo, the Russian military was able to move the front line 40 kilometers away from the city of Donetsk, which makes it impossible to shell civilian areas with barrel artillery. The enemy also lost an important transport hub, and the Kiev regime lost one of the largest lithium deposits in Europe. Russian aircraft are hitting enemy troops retreating from Kurikovo with FAB bombs. And now Russian soldiers are taking down Ukrainian flags on the city streets. Russian flags have already been raised here several times, liberating this settlement in parts. Here is the Russian flag over the thermal power plant, over the administrative building of the pipe plant, over a multi-story building on the western outskirts. Today, the Russian Ministry of Defense reported that the city of Kurikovo is entirely under our control. During active offensive actions, units of the southern group of forces completely liberated the city of Kurikovo. This is the largest settlement in the southwestern part of Donbass. Over the course of 10 years, the Kiev regime has turned it into a powerful fortified area, with a developed network of long-term firing points and underground communications. From the north, it is covered by a reservoir, which significantly limited the maneuverability of Russian assault units. Kurikovo was defended by the most combat-ready enemy units, including nationalist battalions. According to our information, up to 80% of the enemy personnel were killed. Behind me is the road to Kurikovo, over which the Russian flag now flies. Around me are buildings scarred by battles, shell craters, but the most dangerous thing is the sky. It is silent now. now, the weather is not suitable for drones. The battles for a large settlement took place in several stages. The enemy clung to every street, every house, but, nevertheless, the deeply echeloned defense could not withstand this onslaught. The barrel and rocket artillery of the 238th Artillery Brigade of the 8th Army of the South Group worked in a targeted manner, smoking the enemy out of concrete shelters. Specifically, this grad was noted in the Kurkovo direction. It was a great nuisance to the enemy, disrupting rotations, destroying supply routes, and also closely interacted with our advancing troops. With armored vehicles and infantry, they could supply the trapped enemy only along one road, known to our artillerymen. The Russian barrel artillery was already a point weapon of destruction. The high-precision Krasnopol shell hits without a miss. In this important section of the front, the soldiers of the 51st Guards Army were harmoniously opening up the enemy's holes. The defenders of Russia from the 5th Brigade created a barrage of fire, while the assault troops were moving forward. The liberation of the city of Kurkovo is an important step for the entire offensive. From here to the highway, that leads to Krasnoarmysk, renamed Pokrovsk in Ukraine, from the south is only a few kilometers, and thus this settlement finds itself in a semi-ring of Russian troops, cut off from supplies in the suburb of Kurkovo. From the village of Shevchenko, there is a lithium deposit here, one of the largest in Europe. It was discovered back in 1982 under the USSR, but Ukraine never began developing this deposit. The Kiev authorities tried to sell it first to the United States, then to Australia. The lithium reserves, without which it is impossible to produce modern batteries, would be enough for the entire European Union until 2050. And today the Russian Defense Ministry reported another liberated village in the DPR, Dachinsk in the Pokrovsk direction. At the same time, Russian troops are advancing east of the city of Myrnograd. This is footage of a battle near Yelizavetovka. A Russian tank and 3 infantry fighting vehicles collided with 2 enemy tanks. This duel took place at a distance of 50 meters, but the enemy missed twice, and the Russian tankers managed to penetrate the armor of the enemy tank. The enemy retreated, and our column successfully delivered the landing force. In the area of Pavlograd in the Dnipropetrovsk region, the target of the missile strike was an enemy C-300 complex. The launcher, combat control vehicle, radar and up to 45 militants were destroyed. Garand drones hit enemy targets in a number of regions, including explosions on the outskirts of Kiev and in the area of the Borispil airport. The enemy's railway management reported the defeat of the contact electrical network. In the Kupiansk area, Russian aviation destroyed another crossing that the enemy used to supply its troops. France is preparing to transfer Mirage fighters to Kiev. According to local media, this will happen in the coming weeks. The first batch of fighters will consist of 3 aircraft. Ukrainian pilots learned to fly them for several months. Created in the 1970s and taken from the reserves of the French Air Force, these fighters have undergone modernization. They received the ability to launch Storm Shadow cruise missiles. Well, the French Mirage fighters are the first European fighters for the Kiev regime capable of using this type of weapon. In total, Paris plans to supply Ukraine with about a dozen such fighters. In the Kursk region, Russian troops stopped an enemy attempt to break through our defense in the direction of the village of Bolshoy Solditskoy. As reported by the Russian Defense Ministry, the main enemy forces were destroyed on the approaches to the farm of Berdy. In this attack, the enemy lost a lot of NATO equipment and up to 150 militants. Rosgvardia drones with fiber optic control first shot down an enemy mine-clearing vehicle, and then tracked down a column of equipment and hit the tank leading it. Russian special forces stopped another column in a forest plantation, and then successively destroyed combat vehicles one after another. During this battle alone, our military burned 8 armored vehicles, and then they finished off the remaining enemy infantry. The Kursk adventure is not pursuing military, but political goals. This fact was acknowledged by the U.S. Secretary of State. During his visit to Seoul, Blinken said that positions in the Kursk region are important, since they will be taken into account in future peace talks. The fact that the United States considers the seizure of Russian territory a useful action was the first admission from Washington since Ukraine's invasion of Kursk in August last year. Previously, American officials had insisted that they did not know the true purpose of the attack and that America was not involved in the attack.
But we do look forward to your generosity in 2025.
You mean my immense pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, my dear friend. What did BRICS accomplish in 2024?
Starting with that summit in Kazan in October, which was really groundbreaking. The most extraordinary scene of the summit was possibly the round table with all the BRICS members, plus the BRICS plus partners, and some international organizations. The UN was present as well, all that presided by Putin. And basically, everybody had the right to speak. Everybody, it was a consensus of the global majority, in fact. Everybody on the same table, given the right to speak and to say anything they wanted with no mediation at all. This in itself was absolutely extraordinary. There were no grand proclamations at the BRICS summit, but it was a message that was perfectly understood across the global south and the global majority, that this is a new geopolitical group that is finally finding its ground and with a long-term project of coming up with something different from the rules-based international order. So this was the biggest accomplishment of last year. Yes.
Is Turkey at last a full-fledged member of BRICS, or is it still in that sort of associate provisional wait-and-see category?
It's even more complicated, Judge. They were officially invited to be BRICS partner. There are 13 BRICS partners that they announced in Kazan in October. Turkey is one of them. They haven't responded that officially, And early this week, we had already an enormous bombshell, in fact, announced by the Brazilians who are presiding BRICS in 2025. Guess what? Indonesia was admitted as a full BRICS member, not even as a partner, straight into the top BRICS. So because Saudi Arabia at the moment, they say that they are part of BRICS 10, but not exactly, because they don't go to all the meetings. They're still hedging their bets. Everybody knows why. Because MBS is still terrified of American power. So he still has to hedge his bets. Steps in Indonesia, which is the powerhouse of Southeast Asia, and it's going to be one of the greatest economies of this century, immediately as, let's say, the BRICS number 10, sidestepping Saudi Arabia, and directly. So it's a geopolitical earthquake, absolutely.
In President Putin and President Xi's wildest imaginings, where would they like to see BRICS in 5 or 10 years?
As the builder and the organizer of a different system of international relations, more equitable, with voices for everybody sitting on the same table. Obviously, bypassing not only the US dollar, but also the euro. Most of trade among BRICS members and BRICS partners in their own currencies, which means that BRICS is not a direct affront to the US-dominated world order. It's mostly an affront to the IMF and the World Bank. And the number one problem that BRICS has to deal with in the next 5 years is foreign debt. Countries, big power, mid-level nations across BRICS, all of them are different levels. They cannot grow if they have enormous foreign debt, especially vis-a-vis IMF and the World Bank. So this is something that they have to find a way to solve that, and at least attenuate that by increasing loans and investments and trade in general in their own currencies. And this is already ongoing.
Staying on 2024, but switching our focus, what became of the axis of resistance in 2024?
It's an absolutely crucial question, Judge. And we cannot say that as it stands. What we do know is that there were major blows against the axis of resistance, especially Lebanon and Syria. Not in Yemen, not in Iraq. And in terms of Iran, it's even more complicated because in Iran, there's the clash of two vectors, let's put it this way. One of them, more Western oriented, in many aspects, Atlanticist, they want a closer relations with the West. And that includes, very, very important, the current government. Pezeshkian as president, Arakshi as foreign minister, and Zarif, great, great friend of John Kerry, by the way, as vice president. And the other axis is, no, we need to increase our support to the axis of resistance, especially considering these latest blows in terms of the loss of Syria completely and against Hezbollah. But what's happening at the same time? Hezbollah is reorganizing very, very quick. The echoes that we have from Lebanon, and we have good connections across Lebanon, is that Hezbollah is quietly reorganizing at breakneck speed. So they will be back, and they will find a way to compensate the loss of the supply line, a chain from Iran across Syria to Lebanon. Iran, yes, please.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, go ahead.
Just to be precise, when we say, and we use this phrase all the time, Pepe, when we say axis of resistance, resistance to what? The Netanyahu government?
I'll be very blunt. Israel and the United States. This is the short answer. It's, of course, much more nuanced than that. Right. It's essentially against what Israel is doing in Gaza and in the West Bank, and now in southern Lebanon, the bombing of great swathes of southern Lebanon and southern Beirut as well. What they are doing in Syria, which is illegally encroaching on parts of southern Syria. So it's a war against Israel, which didn't start a year and a half ago. It started in the 1940s. And of course, the fact that Israel could not do what they do without full US support.
Right.
So essentially, that's it. Of course, we could go on forever on the declinations.
Right. Understood. A great description, Pepe. Thank you very much. Talk to us, if you would, about the current or coming preeminence of China.
Well, it's part of my first column of the year. I started to write it this morning before talking to you. I'm trying to put in one column all these variables that are directly related to Trump 2.0, of course, and this clash between the collective West and the BRICS universe and the global majority, in fact. China, they will be concentrating 2025 on a triad. The tech war against the US, basically, this is the war between the US and China is a technological war. And the Chinese, when they came up with that concept of Made in China 2025, I remember very well because this happened even before Trump came to power in early 2017. I was following this very, very closely. And then when Trump came with the first batch of sanctions against China, the Chinese simply stopped talking about Made in China 2025 and kept doing what they were doing, which was we need to be the top 1, 2, or 3 in these 10 domains of high technology by 2025. And they're already there in at least half of them. And they will accomplish that maybe in the next 2 or 3 years.
How about militarily? How powerful is China?
We still don't know because most of the military prowess data is classified in China. So, including our friends in the Beltway, they have educated or uneducated guesses, right?
But the fact that Russia and China are collaborating at the highest level in terms of their strategic relationship, also on a military level, which is something, by the way, that will be included in this crucial deal that will be signed 3 days before Trump comes to power on the 17th between Russia and Iran in Moscow. It's a comprehensive.
What is the deal? Is it a full-fledged defense pact?
It's a full-fledged economic, energy, and also defense pact. That's why it took, Judge, over 2 years of negotiations until they had the final document only a few weeks ago max, and now on the table for Pezeshkian in Tehran, on the table for Putin in Moscow, and they're going to sign it in a few days.
If Tel Aviv and Washington attack Tehran after this document is signed, does Moscow get involved?
Theoretically, it could. Exactly. But once again, there are degrees of what kind of attack. Does this attack, is this attack configured in Moscow as an attack not only against Iran, but also against BRICS as a whole, against the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, against the Iran-Russia strategic partnership, etc.? It depends what kind of attack. Okay. But if it's a really hardcore attack, yes, Moscow will help Tehran. There's no question. And this is something that they had been discussing in detail since, it's almost 2 years. The first time that I heard this directly from Iranian officials in Moscow was like in March or April of 2023, when they were saying, look, both sides were talking to each other and okay, whatever you need, you got it. It's at this level. And the fact that the relationship, not the presidency in Iran, the most important relationship is Ayatollah Khamenei. Khamenei and Putin, they have not as close a relationship as Putin and Xi, but it's at the highest level. It's very close, and they understand each other.
Does the world, with the exception of the United States, Great Britain, and Israel, acknowledge that the Western rules-based international order is a sham?
No, they don't. And for them is anathema that the global majority, especially now via BRICS, as a geopolitical superpower and also geoeconomic superpower, especially now with Indonesia, 290 million people, a wealth of natural resources, a big powerhouse, not only in Southeast Asia, but in Asia as a whole. Very important, a Muslim country, a Muslim majority country.
Right.
And for this Atlanticist axis, it's simply impossible to absorb that and understand that these past roughly 250 years of Western domination is coming to a close. At best, the West is going to be one among many on the same table deciding a new set of order for the world, not the rules based that you can change anytime you want. And of course, a reform of the UN, everything is involved. The fact that the BRICS have their own development bank, which is their alternative to the IMF and the World Bank. The fact that BRICS is interconnected with other multilateral organizations like ASEAN in Southeast Asia, the Belt and Road Initiative in China, the Eurasia Economic Union, and most policymakers from Washington to Brussels, not only they cannot absorb that, but they don't even understand how it works, and they don't understand the degree of interconnectedness of all these multilateral organizations.
Is a lasting and sustainable peace between Russia and the United States feasible?
It is feasible if the US wants it, Judge. I'll give you an example, and this is quite striking coming from an European intellectual. Yesterday, I was watching an interview by Emmanuel Todd, which is possibly the #1 remaining great French intellectual, anthropologist, historian, a political scientist, it's a demographer. And he was he came up with a formulation that it's incredible. I'm going to include it in this column that I'm writing today. He said, Trump's job will be to manage the American defeat facing Russia. Nobody put it this way anywhere, as far as I know. Maybe if you
can you repeat that line, please, Pepe?
Yes, of course. So translating literally from the French, the way he said it in an interview, Trump's job will be to manage the American defeat vis-a-vis Russia.
What did he mean?
He means that the U.S. and the collective West lost the war in Ukraine. And he says, look, this is not Afghanistan. This is much more serious. And it is, because Todd is one of the very few high-level, let's say, cross-cultural intellectuals in Europe that understand the war, the American NATO war against Russia, because he's one of the very few who actually tries to understand the Russian position. You know, he reads Putin's speeches, he interprets. It's very rare to find people like that in the UK, in France, in Italy, in Germany. So that's how he interpreted. And that's the crux of his book, which translated from French. He published it over nearly a year ago. It came out, I think, in February last year here in Paris. The Defeat of the West. It has not been translated into English yet. But when it comes out in the US, it's going to be a bombshell, because it's very, very serious. Demography, armament, everything, geography, analysis of Protestantism, analysis of nihilism. You know, it's very, very serious. And Todd is the only one in France capable of doing it, you know, applying this scope of analysis towards the most important clash of the 21st century, which is basically the US against Eurasia. And when you say Eurasia, we say Russia and China, essentially.
I'm going to play a clip from the disreputable American Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, who, of course, disagrees with the conclusion that you've just articulated so nicely, the universal acceptance of American and Western defeat in Ukraine. This is part of a long interview he gave to the New York Times. This clip we're going to run is only about a half a minute long, but in it, you'll hear him repeat the Joe Biden mantra that Putin has failed. Chris, cut number 2.
Do you feel like you've left Ukraine in the strongest position that you could have, or what are the things that you could have done differently?
Well, first, what we've left is Ukraine, which was not self-evident, because Putin's ambition was to erase it from the map. We stopped that. Putin has failed. His strategic objective in regaining Ukraine has failed and will not succeed. Ukraine is standing. And I believe it also has extraordinary potential, not only to survive, but actually to thrive going forward. And that does depend on decisions that future administrations and many other countries will make.
He also said elsewhere in the interview that he believes the Biden administration has established the groundwork for Ukraine to join NATO. It's almost as if he has no memory of the events of the past 3 years.
No memory whatsoever. And we're basically watching a mediocre functionary with no strategic vision posing as a geopolitician. So no wonder it's pathetic, you know.
Yeah.
And no memory, of course, because a part of the narrative, especially of this exiting administration, is total erasure of historical, geographical, political, geopolitical, economic memory.
Will NATO collapse if President Trump pulls the U.S. out of it?
Of course. If President Trump would take the U.S. out of NATO, NATO collapses instantly. There's no question. NATO is the U.S. It's the U.S. plus a bunch of vassals, essentially.
Europe's in bad shape. Pepe. I mean, well, the government in Austria has collapsed. The government in Germany has collapsed. The French change prime ministers every 6 months.
Three.
Every 3 months, right? Who would have thought that the most stable government in Europe is the country from which you just finished the very happy visit, the land of my grandparents?
Of course. And I was so happy to be in Italy these past 2 weeks. Wow. Even with all the trouble and all the sorrows, of course, the economy is devastated in many aspects. 50% of the Italian population, they are basically surviving or living with their parents because they cannot even afford to pay rent, you know. I had some incredible conversations with the people, with people who do trade in Florence, which is something that comes since forever, as we know.
Right, right.
And they were complaining that the Chinese are taking over everything. They are complaining that South Asians, Bangladeshis, Nepalis, Indians, and Pakistanis, they run all the shops. So there's no job for Italians, unless you are in the luxury industry, which of course in Firenze and Tuscany is, but this is a niche market.
But the government is stable, is it not?
This government is stable because Meloni is very, very clever, and the people who are behind her, they are also very clever because they know how to keep this government running with the minimum, and including their gigantic internal debt, for instance. But now France is surpassing Italy in terms of debt. And the fact that Italy is decentralized, it's not heavily centralized as here in France. You see certain regions in Italy who are thriving. Emilia-Romagna is always thriving. Piemonte is always thriving. Lombardia is always thriving. Parts of Tuscany as well. And they don't, basically, they don't give a damn about Rome.
Right.
Or the South, as you know very well. You know.
Right.
So you see two Italys all the time. An Italy that is everything that we imagine in terms of powerhouse, industrial powerhouse, glamour, etc. And this over 50% of Italy who is practically submerged. And this is very painful to watch, especially in Rome itself.
Pepe, it's a pleasure, my dear friend. And nobody gives us analysis.
Were the Al-Qaeda and the Muslims, they were very motivated to fight. I truly believe that. First of all, thank you very much for having me. I wish you and your respected audience a happy and peaceful year. I'm not very optimistic, but let's hope for the best. There are multiple factors why the Assad government fell. To begin with, I truly believe that funneling tens of billions of dollars, we're talking about tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons of ammunition being pumped or dumped into the Syrian, let's say, market. And most of which went into the hands of very radical groups, and they were very motivated to fight against the government because they saw the government as a secular infidel regime, which means they have to remove it for religious purposes. So this was like a holy war initiated by these radical groups. And this was stated by a secret document by the Defense Intelligence Agency of the US in 2012, that the driving force behind the insurgency were the Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood groups. So this is number one. The second thing were the interference of the, let's say, regional and international intelligence apparatuses into the country to destabilize the country and facilitate the regime change. The third, I would argue, also the sanctions. The sanctions were so draconian, Judge, that if you want to buy a medical equipment from Malaysia, from Indonesia, from China, from anywhere around the world, a medical equipment, you cannot pay for it. And if you want to bring it from the black market, if the United States detects that Syria has bought any equipment from outside, any technological equipment from outside, from a third country company, they would sanction that third country company. So the country has been devastated on all levels, including the great corruption. And when I say great in a negative connotation, because when you sanction the country, it was already there was already widespread corruption in Syria. But when you sanction the economy of the country, and the country basically becomes malfunctional and it doesn't function well, then you will see the rise of parallel economies. And who is going to be in charge of parallel economies are the warlords, cronies, and people who have invested interest in keeping the country's economy dysfunctional. So we had this Syrian economy has been paralyzed, and at the same time we have seen the rise of corrupted people who have had their grip over the economy. And all these things have led, in my opinion, into the demoralization of the Syrian people, and they no longer wanted to continue the fight after 14 years of fighting against this foreign-backed insurgency. Therefore, Assad has fled the country. I think those were the main factors.
Who or what led the American State Department to put a $10 million bounty on al-Jawlani's head and to denominate his group as a terrorist organization? And I believe the British did the same.
Actually, the State Department, they have been following Jawlani for a long time. He has been in Iraq, and he was responsible for sending car bombs into civilian neighborhoods. I mean, even the head of Al-Qaeda back then in Afghanistan, he rejected the notion of Jawlani to send car bombs into civilian neighborhoods. He was more radical than his command center, basically, in Afghanistan. So he was imprisoned in Iraq and later freed miraculously, and he formed the Al-Qaeda offshoot in Syria. So everybody in the intelligence community knew who al-Jawlani is, and it was very controversial to keep him off the terrorist list. So they put him on the terrorist list, but at the same time they sent weapons to what is called the Free Syrian Army. So what is the Free Syrian Army? The Free Syrian Army are, let's say, less radical militants among the anti-Assad groups in the country, but they were fighting shoulder to shoulder with the Al-Qaeda. So once you give all these weapons, the Toyota trucks, the technologies, and the ammunition to the Free Syrian Army, the Free Syrian Army either sold these weapons to Al-Nusra Front or Al-Qaeda, or Al-Qaeda was, because more powerful, they have taken over these weapons. So during this time, when the regime change war was over in 2017, in the military sense, Trump ended it and said, why are we wasting $1 billion over arming these jihadists in Syria? No, we impose sanctions on the country, we devastate the economy, and we can demoralize the people and do regime change with minimum budget. And this was successful at the end of the day. But during this time, because Jawlani's army was the strongest group on the ground against Assad, they didn't want to keep him on the terrorist list, so they started to rebrand him, rebranding him from the leader of Al-Qaeda into another group called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. And during this time, the first interview that Jawlani gave to an American press, I think this was to PBS, and he started wearing a suit and shaving his beard a little bit and saying that he's becoming moderate, and this was only a phase in his life, that he used to send car bombs and decapitate people and kill people for belonging to a certain religion. But now he has changed, right? He has changed, but nowadays I want to give an example, for example, Judge, for your respected audience to know. The Minister of Justice of Syria now under HTS, the Minister of Justice of Jawlani has been an Islamic judge in Idlib, where Jawlani used to control in the past. And this person has been documented in 2 videos overseeing the execution of 2 women in the streets in Idlib, killing them with guns over their heads. And he was there in the video for adultery. So accusing someone of an adultery, just an accusation, it could get you killed under Jawlani's regime. And now this person is the Minister of Justice. And the head of the intelligence of Jawlani now, he was the person who used to bring messages between al-Baghdadi of ISIS and al-Jawlani, because they didn't use these technological means. So they had people, messengers coming and between these 2 persons of ISIS and al-Qaeda. Right. And this person was the messenger between them, and he's now the head of the Syrian intelligence.
So Syria has gone from bad to worse, notwithstanding what the American press would have you believe. If the Minister of Justice is on tape presiding over an execution for an allegation of adultery.
Definitely. I think I reported that Syria, for example, in 2010, Josh, just 1 year before the war, it was considered one of the safest countries in the region, and it had over 8.5 million tourists per year in Syria, with the GDP reached to $60 billion. So we're speaking about a functioning economy, very safe place. Yes, there were limitations for political freedoms, but I would argue that stability comes before democracy. And without stability, you cannot establish a democratic system in any country. So we have to prioritize stability in this case. Now, because Giuliani's rule is very convenient for the US, Germany, the UK, they have invested in him a lot. And they wanted for Assad to be gone for geopolitical reasons, not because of the human rights record in Syria. If it was about the human rights record, Giuliani's record is way worse.
What prompted then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to issue the waiver to allow American diplomats and intelligence personnel to provide aid to HTS and to interact with Giuliani, even though HTS was a terrorist organization and Giuliani had the bounty on his head?
Yeah, he was the most powerful military wing in Syria, capable of challenging the Assad government. It wasn't a situation where you can pick and choose among different groups and say, no, I don't want to support HTS, I will support other groups. No, the vast majority of the militants who joined the anti-Assad camp were radical Islamists, and they wanted to establish an Islamic state. So it wasn't an ideal situation where one side is a revolutionary, but they supported the Islamists. No, the people who wanted to carry and continue the fighting were the Islamists, and they were motivated by religious texts and verses, and Saudi Arabia and Qatar have been giving lots of support to radical imams, giving basically fatwas after fatwas to multinational jihadists coming from all around the world to join the fight against Assad. I would like to give an example. There was a famous imam in Qatar called Sheikh Al-Qaradawi, and he issued a fatwa on Al Jazeera, the Qatari-funded TV, saying basically that anyone who worked for the Assad government, civilian or military, so if you work in a public sector in Syria, or you are a soldier in the Assad government, it is permissible to kill this person. And tens of thousands of people perished because of this fatwa issued on the Qatari-funded Al Jazeera. So all these things, in my opinion, we have to take it into consideration, including why they are supporting HTS. Why would Mike Pompeo, or before him Hillary Clinton, or now Antony Blinken support this type of insurgency, or supported this type of insurgency in Syria to break the axis of resistance? This is what is called the axis between Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. They wanted to break Syria as the strategic depth of the axis of resistance. This is one. Two, they wanted to extend the gas pipelines from Qatar to Turkey, and Turkey would distribute these gas pipelines, or this gas, to Europe. So in the future, let's suppose in 50 years from now, the Russians and the Europeans would reconcile again. Now that Qatar can extend these gas pipelines to Europe, Europe would not need the Russian gas any longer. So they wanted for Qatar to extend these gas pipelines. And that's why Qatar and Turkey were the most enthusiastic about removing Assad in the past 12 years, I would argue.
Here's a clip from December 29th of Al Giuliani. There's an English translation, as you'll hear. After the West had, of course, persuaded him to change his appearance. Cut number 7, Chris.
Russia is an important country and is considered the second most powerful country in the world. And there are deep strategic interests between Syria and Russia. There are deep strategic interests between Syria and Russia. Syrian weapons are all Russian. Many of the power plants are Russian with Russian expertise, and there are great cultural ties between Syria and Russia. We do not want Russia to exit Syria, as some would like.
Run number 8 as well, Chris.
Syria cannot continue without relations with a large regional country like Iran. but they must be based on diplomatic relations, respect for the sovereignty of the two countries, non-interference in internal affairs, and only relations that are compatible with the interests of the two countries without interfering in the matters of sectarian hatreds. We hope that the new American administration will not follow in the same approach of the previous administration in continuing these sanctions and will lift them without entering into negotiations or bargaining.
What is your take on this new al-Jawlani? Is he believable? Is he a tool of the West, or is he duping the West?
I think he's the tool of Turkey. HTS is mostly a construct of the Turkish intelligence, and they had the geographical, let's say, connectivity with Turkey for a long time because Idlib is on the borders with Turkey, and they had an open border between Turkey and Syria, receiving different types of weapons and ammunition. However, I would also argue that because Turkey is a NATO country, I don't think that the Americans had no clue what the Turks are doing there. That the US has a big military base in Incirlik, and they were overseeing the influx of these weapons and ammunition and aid to Jawlani. The former special envoy of the US, James Jeffrey, to Syria, he famously said al-Jawlani's group has been an asset for the US strategy in Syria because they were, like, I don't want to even call them realistic, but this is what realpolitik is about. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. This is how they treated with Jawlani. But now I think the Americans will exert some pressure on al-Jawlani because they want him to stay in line and not to go rogue completely, especially on the neighboring countries, because HTS is tens of different military groups, and everyone is there are so many rogue elements in HTS committing ethnic cleansing against the minorities, for example, in Homs and in Latakia, and they are running they are persecuting women publicly, documented on video, right? So the Americans cannot really tolerate this to be in public, right? So they will exert pressure on Jawlani in two aspects. One, they want him to stay passive with Israel, and in the next few years to normalize ties with Israel. I would argue that in 3 to 5 years, you will see Israeli flag flying over Damascus because under Assad, Assad didn't recognize the legitimacy of the political entity of Israel. But we will see this sooner or later in Syria. Secondly, that the Qataris would and the Turks would have their strategic interests met in the country, including the gas pipelines. And that is why, if you notice what Jawlani said about Russia, that he doesn't mind that the Russians stay in the country, because this was an international deal struck between Turkey, Russia, and the United States. And this after this deal, Assad fled the country.
Can you add Israel to that group?
Definitely. I would argue that the Israelis had a big interest in removing Assad from power because 2 weeks or 3 weeks before Assad fell, the Jordanian foreign minister was in Damascus, delivering basically an American-Israeli message to Assad and asking him that there is going to be a ceasefire agreement in Lebanon with Hezbollah. And once the ceasefire agreement is reached, we expect from you to siege Hezbollah, which means you have to cut the supply chains of Hezbollah from Syria. And Assad rejected it. And in a matter of few days, the regime change reignited in the country, just few hours after Netanyahu gave a public speech and said that Assad is playing with fire. So Israel invested a lot, and also with HTS. For your respected audience, I mean, the Wall Street Journal, the UN peacekeeping forces, the Israeli press, the Israeli officials, they all acknowledged that they have given weapons, money, training, and also medical treatment to Jawlani's group when they used to occupy the borders between Syria and the
even though this is a felony under American law and under British law.
Yes, and the former head of Mossad on Al Jazeera, he was with Mehdi Hassan. He was challenged by Mehdi Hassan about this case, and he said, "You're giving weapons or you're giving medical treatment to Al Qaeda affiliated group. They attacked your #1 ally in the United States," and he said, "But they never attacked us." According to my memory, he said the Al Qaeda never attacked us. and we're dealing them on a tactical level, on a humanitarian level. And then Mahdi Hassan said, okay, what if a Hezbollah militant was injured? Would you take him into Israel and treat him? He says, no, we don't treat Hezbollah militants because they have conducted acts of hostilities against Israel, unlike Al-Qaeda. So the question here is, I'm not calling for attacks on Israel. I'm just asking a simple question. Why Al-Qaeda and ISIS never attacked Israel in this case? And one time there was a minor clash between the IDF and ISIS on the borders. The ISIS issued an apology for Israel in this case. So these are all good questions we have to ask. I was watching a video, an interview for Professor Michael Hudson, and he says basically Al-Qaeda is a contract army for the United States in the region. And after all these developments from Afghanistan to Syria to Libya, it gives the impression that, I'm not saying that they have the US can control all Al-Qaeda elements, but definitely on the top level of the hierarchy, there is some sort of intelligence communication in order to direct these militants against the enemies of the United States. It doesn't make sense that when the Palestinians have been slaughtered en masse in Gaza, none of these groups claimed that they want to try to save the Palestinians in Gaza, or elsewhere. And I'm not calling for them to save, because they're not any better than the people who are committing genocide in Gaza. But I'm asking,
understood. Who or what governs what a month ago was the sovereign territory of Syria? How has it been divided?
Now the Syrian territory, before Assad is gone or after?
After Assad is gone. Today, who governs the various geographical areas that were once governed by Assad?
So on the eastern shore of the Euphrates, the Americans and the Kurdish militias, the SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, this is 1/3 of the country anyways. Now, between Aleppo to Idlib, to Homs, to Damascus, it's mostly HDS under Turkish intelligence. The Russians have a presence in Latakia and in Tartus in the coastal side of Syria, but they don't have any strong military presence in order to keep the posture of the region or protect the minorities there, because they are being now, they are slaughtered by HDS basically. And in the south, we have a governorate called Asweda. Asweda is mostly populated by the Druze, and they're asking for an autonomy now. I think what is going to happen to Syria is they will...
Before you predict the future, how much of Syria has been taken by the Israelis?
Actually, larger than the Gaza Strip. So they already captured the Golan Heights in 1967, and now the territories they occupied is way larger than the entire Gaza Strip enclave, basically.
Do they view themselves as a provisional government, or do they view these conquered territories as part of Israel?
It's part of Israel. So they consider this part of Israel forever, and they say they have occupied the highest hill in Syria, and now they have the dominance, the aerial dominance and the technological dominance, basically, because when they install their satellites, then they will oversee entire region in Damascus and also in Lebanon itself. So the Israelis have the upper hand there, and they already posted that Mount Hermon is now part of Israel, and they have annexed it. And I don't think that the Syrian side is capable of pushing them back or has the will. And I'm talking about HDS in this case, because they're not trying to push the Israelis away. They're 20 kilometers away from Damascus now.
Where is this going in the next 5 years?
I think the first phase is going to be federalization of Syria. So I'm not against a federal state, a federal system, but for using federalism to unite between the already divided countries in the region, because the region is already divided since 100 years by Sykes and Picot. So if Iraq and Syria want to create a federal system, or Lebanon or Jordan or Palestine, to unify and create an economic integration between these countries, that's amazing. But if you want to divide what it was already divided, which means Syria will be divided into 4 to 5 different mini states, federal states, then this is only going to create more the conditions for more inner conflict between these groups, because they will be ethno-states, like ethno-religious states, just like in Israel, right? And they will start fighting against each other, and this will create the conditions for the US and Israel to present themselves as the savior of minorities, especially the Druze and the Kurds. I think this is where the country is headed to, federalism at the beginning and then the Balkanization of the country. And I hope I am wrong, Judge, and I will definitely be happy that I would be wrong about this case, because I would like to see one unified country. I'm Syrian at the end of the day. But am I hopeful? Am I optimistic? No.
What about Al-Jilani? What becomes of him?
Jolani said that he's not going to do elections for the next 4 years. So he's going to stay another 4 years. He said that they need 3 years to redraft the constitution for Syria. Although he changed the curriculum in a matter of 3 days in the country. And if you want to know, he is changing the entire
curriculum. You mean in the schools?
Schools, yes. He removed, for example, in the science textbooks, the theory of evolution, and that our brains were developed in the past, and he only insists on the religious text that we were created as Adam and Eve. There is no evolution at all. And he's changing, for example, the concept of martyrdom from someone who dies for the sake of his country to someone who died for the sake of God. And also in the textbooks now, the Jews and the Christians are the people whom God is angry at, according to the new curriculum of Syria. So he's Islamizing basically the Syrian education system, something that I mentioned at our first conversation, that he will try to have his grip over the education, over the press, over the religious affairs. So he has the control the minds and the hearts of the people. And then if they revolt against him, he has the weapons. And in the next stage, he will redraft the constitution in the next 3 years. So 3 years is going to be the de facto ruler. And in the 4th year, he says he will hold elections. Will he participate in his elections? I think it depends on the conditions in the country. But in 4 years, Syria has moved from one of the safest countries in the world into a jungle, lawless jungle. So what could you expect in 4 years?
Is it safe for Christians in Syria?
No, not at all. I mean, I'm reading daily reports from Syria, especially in Homs and in Latakia, killings against Christians and against the Alawites, especially against the Alawites. Like, I've seen countless videos, Judge, of summary executions, humiliations. They are capturing men en masse in some town, and they are capturing this on video, basically. They're either executing them or saying that you have to howl like a dog or we will kill you. So they're humiliating the people like that. We've seen lots of robberies, and because the Christians are trying to defend themselves and they're getting killed in the process. One of the Christians were decapitated last week in the Valley of the Christians in Homs. So there's so many examples that are documented on video that I'm already posting on my X account, and those are only the documented ones. So imagine the ones that we couldn't document. So if somebody comes and says that HTS has reformed itself, yeah, probably they have started wearing some suit and ties, etc., to give the impression. But on the their militants are doing is basically ethnically cleansing the Christians and the Alawites from the country. And the next step you will see these NGOs come and say for the minorities, we opened for you the resettlement programs, refugee status, etc. How many Christians left in the country, Judge? They were 10% of the people. They're probably 2% or something now of the country. So nothing left.
Got it. Kevork, thank you. Not a happy story, but as you said at the outset, maybe something good will
Basically, there's a new announcement about BRICS expansion. This is an organization that brings together the countries of the global south, formerly colonized countries, so they can collaborate and to develop economically and to create alternatives to the Western-dominated financial system. BRICS was founded in 2009 by Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And then in 2010, South Africa joined. And since then, BRICS has continued to grow. In January 2025, they announced the newest member will be Indonesia. This is very important because Indonesia is the fourth most populous country on Earth and has the seventh biggest economy on Earth. I created an updated map showing the membership of BRICS as of January 2025. There are now 10 countries that are full members of BRICS, including the original 5, plus Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. As of 2025, there are also 8 partner countries in BRICS, which means that they're on the path to becoming a full member in the near future. The 8 partners of BRICS are Belarus, Bolivia, Cuba, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Thailand, Uganda, and Uzbekistan. There are also 5 countries that were invited to join BRICS but have not officially given a response yet. Those are Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Vietnam, Nigeria, and Turkey or Turkey. I created several charts that show how important BRICS has become in the global economy. This is using data from the IMF World Economic Outlook as of October 2024. The 10 full members of BRICS, now that Indonesia has been added, together represent 38.8% of the entire global economy when you measure GDP at purchasing power parity. And then when you add in the new 8 partner countries, so you have 18 members and partners of BRICS in total, this is often referred to as BRICS Plus, together they represent 41.4% of the global economy. I also took the data of the G7 economies and compared them to the BRICS Plus economies, and I made a chart that illustrates how BRICS is now significantly larger than the G7. The G7 is the group of 7 rich countries, that is the West plus Japan. These are the countries that colonize most of the world. That is Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States. As of 2024, they only made up 29% of the world economy, compared to 41.4% for BRICS. And this is a huge shift because back in 1992, the G7 economies made up 47% of the global economy. And the current BRICS countries, obviously BRICS didn't exist in the 90s, but back in 1992, the current BRICS countries only made up 22% of the world economy. So this is an absolutely massive shift in the past 3 decades. And the trend is very clear. Over time, BRICS share of the global economy is increasing, whereas the G7 share, the West share of the global economy, is decreasing over time. Now, the addition of Indonesia to BRICS is very important because Indonesia is one of the largest economies in the global South, and it has been growing very quickly. In fact, in 2023, Indonesia overtook the United Kingdom and France. Its economy is now the 7th largest economy in the world. Indonesia's economy represents 2.4% of global GDP, PPP, whereas the UK and France each only represent 2.2% of the global economy. But think about how much the world talks about countries like the UK and France as if they were still powerful countries. But economically, they're not that powerful anymore. Indonesia has a larger economy. And once again, the trend is going in a clear direction. Over time, Indonesia's share of the world economy is growing, and France's and the UK's share of the global economy is shrinking. Now, what's interesting about Indonesia's admission to BRICS is it actually came as a surprise because previously at the BRICS summit that was held in the Russian city of Kazan in October 2024, Indonesia was invited to become a partner of BRICS on the path to becoming a full member. However, in January 2025, the Foreign Ministry of Brazil announced that Indonesia had become the newest full member of BRICS. By the way, Brazil is currently the chair country of BRICS. So every year, BRICS has an alternating chair. In 2024, the chair was Russia. In 2023, the chair was South Africa. This year, it's Brazil. And Brazil actually announced that Indonesia had been invited to become a full member back at the summit in South Africa in the city of Johannesburg in 2023. However, Indonesia asked for a delay because it had an election coming up. So Indonesia wanted to wait until after the election in order to become a full member of BRICS. Indonesia's new president, Prabowo Subianto, took office in October of 2024. And as of the 6th of January, Indonesia is now officially a full member of BRICS. Brazil emphasized how important this is, noting that Indonesia has the largest population and the largest economy in Southeast Asia. And Brazil said that Indonesia will work together with other members of BRICS to support reforms to global governance institutions and will deepen the cooperation of the Global South, which are priorities for Brazil as the president of BRICS this year. So those are the two main goals, according to the current chair of BRICS. It is to reform global governance institutions. That includes institutions like the United Nations and financial institutions in particular, like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And also the other main goal of BRICS is to deepen cooperation of the Global South. China's foreign ministry also confirmed that Indonesia is now a full member of BRICS. It congratulated Indonesia, and Beijing said that, quote, BRICS is a main platform for promoting solidarity and cooperation of the Global South and a major force driving the reform of the global governance system. BRICS countries are always committed to multilateralism, fairness, and justice, and common development. BRICS's latest edition follows the historic trend of the collective rise of the Global South, end quote. Indonesia's addition to BRICS is also quite symbolic because Indonesia was one of the co-founders of the non-aligned movement back in 1961. This was at a time when the Cold War that the United States was waging was heating up, and the Global South countries in the non-aligned movement said that they refused to join in the Cold War. Instead, they wanted to create a new system based on cooperation and economic development, opposing colonialism. Indonesia's leadership role in the Global South was also deeply symbolic because in 1955, Indonesia had hosted the famous Bandung Conference that brought together formerly colonized countries in Bandung, in Indonesia, to get together to discuss how they can cooperate, to increase trade, to lift their peoples out of poverty, and to support the further decolonization struggles, because at that time, in the 50s, there were still many countries that were colonized by the Western powers. At the time, during the 1955 Bandung Conference and the 1961 creation of the non-aligned movement, Indonesia was led by a leftist anti-imperialist leader named Sukarno. However, in 1965, the United States backed a military coup that overthrew Indonesia's President Sukarno and created a military dictatorship that carried out one of the most horrific massacres of the 20th century. With the support of the CIA, the Indonesian military dictatorship killed between 1 million and 3 million leftists in Indonesia, destroying the Communist Party of Indonesia, which was one of the largest communist parties in the world, and killing many labor organizers and progressive activists. The CIA admitted that this is one of the worst mass killings of the 20th century, and it was supported by the United States. And the people of Indonesia, they still remember this history with horror. For the people of Indonesia, the Cold War was not very cold. It was very hot. It was very bloody. So given that history in Indonesia, and given the long history of the anti-colonialist struggle in Indonesia, it's no surprise that many people in the country are looking toward BRICS, and in particular, they're looking toward China, and they're not looking toward the West. A poll in 2024 found that 73% of Indonesia say that if they were forced to pick a side between China and the United States, 3/4 of people in Indonesia said they would pick China. Only 1/4 of people say they would pick the United States. This poll was conducted looking at countries in ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. These include some of the fastest growing economies in the world, and Indonesia has the largest population and the biggest economy in ASEAN. If you look at the polling in 2024, overall, a majority of people in ASEAN prefer China over the US, especially in Malaysia, where 75% of people prefer China. In Laos, 71% of people prefer China. And in Thailand, 52% of people prefer China. And Thailand is also now a partner of BRICS. The population is more divided in Cambodia and Myanmar. And then in Singapore, Vietnam, and the Philippines, the population leans more toward the United States, especially the Philippines, where the United States has recently created several new military bases. And I should point out that the Philippines was actually previously a U.S. colony from 1898 until 1946. And still today, the political elites in the Philippines are very pro-U.S., including the current president, Bongbong Marcos, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who is the son of the longtime U.S.-backed military dictator who had the same name, Ferdinand Marcos Sr., who ruled the Philippines with an iron fist with U.S. support during the First Cold War. Now, as part of Washington's strategy in the new Cold War that the United States is waging today against China, the U.S. has been trying to recruit new allies in Southeast Asia to join in its very aggressive policies against China. The Philippines has been the main country in the region to join with the U.S. Vietnam has been neutral. Vietnam has very good relations with both China and the U.S. But Indonesia has been leaning away from the U.S. and toward China. In fact, in 2023, there was a political scandal in Indonesia when the United States published a press release claiming that it had an alliance with Indonesia. And the Indonesian government denied this. At this time in 2023, Indonesia's president was Joko Widodo, and Indonesia's defense minister was Prabowo Subianto. Prabowo is now the new president of Indonesia as of October 2024. But back when he was defense minister, he denied this press release that was published by the United States. He said that it was false. So to clarify, the United States published a statement that it claimed was a joint statement with Indonesia. And Indonesia said, no, that was false. Indonesia criticized the U.S. for trying to divide Southeast Asia. And Indonesia's defense minister and now President Prabowo emphasized, he said, quote, "What is important for me to underline is that our relationship with China is very good. We respect each other. We already have a mutual understanding. I conveyed that in the U.S. We are close friends with China. We respect America, and we seek friendship with Russia," end quote. So he made it very clear that Indonesia is not a U.S. ally. Yes, they have good relations with the U.S. They don't want to be an enemy. They don't want to be the target of another U.S.-backed coup and massacre. However, he made it clear that Indonesia is a close friend of China and also seeks friendship with Russia. And now that Indonesia is a full member of BRICS, it's going to deepen its integration with other countries in the global south. And this makes sense for Indonesia because China is by far Indonesia's largest trading partner. As of 2022, 22.6% of Indonesia's exports went to China, and 28.5% of Indonesia's imports came from China. That's by far the largest. No other country comes even close. And it's not just Indonesia. China is the largest trading partner of all of ASEAN. It has been that way for well over a decade. And the share of its total trade that ASEAN does with China is increasing over time, whereas ASEAN's trade with the EU and Japan is decreasing over time. Indonesia also plays a very important role in the global economy because it is by far the biggest producer of nickel on Earth. No country even comes close to producing as much nickel as Indonesia. And by the way, half of the world's top 10 producers of nickel are now in BRICS. Nickel is especially important in the 21st century as countries try to transition away from fossil fuels because of the threat of climate change. And nickel is needed for basically all renewable energy technology, for batteries, solar panels. It's very important. And the Indonesian government has been very clever in how it has used this to propel its economy forward and to develop. In fact, the Indonesian government banned the export of raw minerals because it wanted to capture more of the value added in the process to help to grow its own economy instead of simply exporting unprocessed raw materials, which many countries in the global south have done, losing that potential value. This has angered Western countries and US dominated financial institutions like the IMF and the World Trade Organization, and they have criticized Indonesia, claiming that it's violating free trade principles. But Indonesia emphasizes that this is a matter of sovereignty. This is a matter of defending its own economic interests and using its natural resources to benefit its population and not Western corporations. And China has been very helpful in collaborating with Indonesia in this process, helping it to industrialize and add more value. Even the US Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which is a US think tank that's funded by the US government and is very anti-China, they published an interesting paper titled "How Indonesia Used Chinese Industrial Investments to Turn Nickel into the New Gold." There was another research paper that was published in 2024 by the hawkish Australian think tank, the Australian Institute of International Affairs, which is very anti-China and is funded by the Australian government, and specifically the Australian Ministry of Defense. This paper is titled "Indonesia's Nickel Supremacy, China's Backing, and Australia's Decline." Now, even though this paper is very biased, I actually want to read some parts of it because it shows how brilliant Indonesia's industrial policy has been, how it has used state-led economic development in order to lift its people out of poverty and to become one of the fastest growing large economies in the world. This paper noted that Indonesia's domination of the global nickel market has been carefully planned by the Indonesian government as it looked to boost its downstream industrial policy in critical minerals processing with the backing of Chinese investment. Since 2014, going back to the previous Indonesian president, Joko Widodo, there was strategic planning by Jakarta in order to onshore the added value of nickel supply chains. It started with Indonesia banning nickel exports. This led the European Union to formally complain to the World Trade Organization. Indonesia argued that this is a case of protecting its national economic interests and that global trading rules are unfairly detrimental to developing nations. The Indonesian Minister for Economic Affairs called them a form of economic imperialism. That's an exact quote, economic imperialism, when the International Monetary Fund, which is dominated by the United States, the US is the only country with veto power in the IMF. The IMF demanded that Jakarta remove its export ban, which is why Indonesia called this economic imperialism by the West. In addition to banning raw materials, Indonesia asked for assistance from China, and China not only invested, but it also gave concessional financing. That means below market value. So Chinese state-owned banks and state-owned enterprises were giving very favorable loans to Indonesia and investing in Indonesia to help industrialize. This is an example of what China refers to as win-win cooperation or mutually beneficial development. China benefits because it gets access to nickel, which it needs to make batteries and solar panels. And Indonesia benefits because Chinese state-owned companies are helping to industrialize and training people, Indonesian workers, in how to actually do this, because they previously had no experience in actually processing the nickel. Previously, they had simply exported the nickel, the raw mineral. So China is providing the technical expertise and know-how and the physical capital and investment, and China's also state-owned banks are providing very favorable loans. So it's win-win for both Indonesia and China. This report also noted that China is investing in Indonesia not only to help add value to its process of nickel production, but also to manufacture electric vehicles. So Chinese EV makers like BYD are starting to open up factories in Indonesia, which again is mutually beneficial for both. It helps to provide jobs and develop the local economy in Indonesia. It helps to develop an industrial sector and industrial workers in Indonesia who can go on to create their own companies. And of course, China benefits as well. This paper noted that China financed the supporting infrastructure in Indonesia needed for nickel processing. This was set up in Indonesia through China's Belt and Road Initiative, and there have been massive benefits in Indonesia. Indonesia now adds value to its exports of nickel. Previously, when Indonesia was only exporting raw nickel ore, it exported just around 6 billion in 2013. However, a decade later, as of 2022, Indonesia exported 30 billion. So they quintupled the value of their exports, because if you're just exporting the raw ore, you're not capturing a lot of the value added in the process. But if you process that ore and you actually create processed nickel, you can make 5 times as much money. And now Indonesia is attracting manufacturers to create electric vehicle batteries in Indonesia. And as this think tank funded by the Australian government put it, quote, Indonesia's nickel bet has paid off, end quote. Quote, Indonesia's success has been Australia's loss. And it added that Indonesia's two-pronged strategy of industrial and trade policy was made possible due to its economic partnership with China. So I think this is the perfect example of what BRICS cooperation can look like going forward. Western countries have exploited these countries in the global south for centuries. In fact, Indonesia was colonized by the Netherlands, which is now part of the European Union. And here we are in the 21st century, and the EU is trying to use the World Trade Organization, and the US is trying to use the IMF to prevent Indonesia from using its own resources to benefit its people, to develop its economy. They complain that Indonesia is using protectionist policies and restricting exports of ores, of raw materials. And yet we see in the US and in Europe, their governments are also moving toward protectionism. But they're telling the rest of the world only the West is allowed to use protectionist policies and tariffs and export restrictions. But meanwhile, when the global south tries to do it to benefit its own population, the US and the EU use the World Trade Organization and the IMF to try to punish these countries. This explains why so many people in the global south are looking to BRICS as a possibility for an alternative. It's why they're collaborating to try to create alternative financial institutions, to create alternatives to the US-dominated IMF and the World Bank. That's why BRICS created the New Development Bank, which is an alternative to the World Bank. And BRICS also is developing an alternative to the IMF, which can provide liquidity for countries that are dealing with balance of payments issues. So there are so many exciting things happening in BRICS in the global south. If you want to get more information about the proposal that BRICS has made to transform the international monetary and financial system, in the description below, I will link to a video and a report that I published that summarizes a lengthy report that was published by Russia in 2024 in its capacity as the chair of BRICS, that details their plans for transforming the global financial system and creating alternatives to Western domination and the US dollar. Of course, de-dollarization is at the heart of what BRICS is doing, creating alternatives to the dollar system in which the US benefits. It has the exorbitant privilege of printing the global reserve currency, and the US can create more and more debt and export its inflation to the rest of the world because of global demand for dollars. So more and more countries in BRICS have been trading with each other in their local currencies, including Indonesia, and ASEAN countries are using their local currencies for trade, not the dollar, and other BRICS members are using local currencies. There are so many exciting things happening. If you like learning about what's going on in the world and you want to get more information, please subscribe to Geopolitical Economy Report. Please like and share this. I am Ben Norton, the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please come back soon. I will see you next time.
Kofi, follow me.